Some of you may know that Ron Robbins' granddaughter, his first granddaughter, is named Chloe. So I thought it was really appropriate he got to read the scripture from from 1 Corinthians about Chloe's people, since he is one of them. Paul probably heard through Chloe, and she was very likely a leader in the church in Corinth, that there were some divisions, that people were confused really about who indeed was the one that they were supposed to follow based on their baptism. Can you imagine if you were baptized by someone that you had to follow that person, not Jesus Christ? It would be really, really confusing. So some people were trying to follow Paul, and some were saying they were followers of Peter or Apollos or Christ. But for Paul, it's always Christ. And Paul has a connection to that church, but it's not as deep, and he's grateful for that because he's not the one causing the divisions. He says he's glad he's not, at least this time, because Paul can cause divisions. But they're dividing themselves when they ought to be united under Christ. And that's always a good message for us to hear. And that Christ's sacrifice of his life represents the power of God, and that's what unites them, and it unites us in faith. But then we look at the community of Matthew, and it's an interesting take that the writer of the gospel does here, because he focuses on finding ways to refer to the Hebrew scriptures in telling Jesus' story. So after John the Baptist is arrested, Jesus begins proclaiming the good news in Galilee, what was long ago the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. And he starts calling forth disciples. Simon and Andrew, James and John, they leave their fishing boats. And when we think about it, this passage reflects back in Isaiah, the one sent from God. So going through Galilee, teaching in the synagogues and healing those who are sick, those were the things that the one sent from God was purported to be doing. Well, I have to tell you, I'm fortunate to have friends from seminary and a clergy group that I meet with regularly. And we ministers often call on each other when we face out of the ordinary things. I get asked every once in a while, what do I do with this? Or do you have resources for that? Or have you ever faced such and such? And the other day I heard a story of one minister who presided at a funeral for someone who was in his 40s, late 40s, and his vocation was that he was a tow truck driver. And these days, the service was very well attended. She had a hard time parking in the parking lot. But then when she got into the car with the funeral director, she realized that lined up behind them were all tow trucks. That the casket of this gentleman was being carried on a tow truck. And it was appropriate, I suppose, in that case, because he had a lot of connections due to his business. So when his colleagues heard the call, all of them arrived at the surface in their tow trucks. And you can imagine the procession to the cemetery. It was out in the Midwest, and they were driving along the highway, along back roads, and it was all tow trucks. Big and small, older and new, and it must have been a pretty interesting sight. But we don't always see huge numbers at funerals, because many tend to go to visiting hours. But that day, whatever their connection, those tow truck drivers had their own personal reasons for responding to the call and showing up and following this apparently well-loved man to his final resting place. Well, I don't think it's quite the same as a call to follow Jesus, to come and follow me, but in one way it is, because if we think about this text, each of those men on the shore that Jesus approached were compelled to leap out and follow Jesus. And we really have no idea of the private or personal reasons that they did this. Peter and Andrew, James and John left behind their fishing nets and their families behind that first day, and they followed after Jesus. We don't know why. We just know that they did. And, it turns out in the ministry, as we hear the stories in the Gospels, we know that they responded to Jesus' call to them over and over again, day after day after day. And sometimes it was in small ways, and sometimes it was in big ways that they stepped up. And then, of course, on some days, they heard it and responded more clearly and competent than others, and others didn't do so well. You can imagine Peter faltering on the water, or the disciples wondering about Jesus when he talks to the woman at the well, or the inclination that they had to send the hungry crowds away without feeding them. Jesus had to nudge them along in all those cases. The thing is, about following, it all comes down to Jesus. And that's what Paul was telling those confused people in Corinth, that we are all baptized into Jesus, no matter who did the baptizing. And then when we are to follow, we are to listen to what Jesus teaches, that we are to do what he does, but not get bogged down in the details of maybe some of the leaders in the church or their ideas or your own personal ideas. The whole idea is that we are supposed to listen to what Jesus teaches, do what Jesus does, because other voices, even our own, can lead us off track. So Jesus calls us as individuals and as a community, but we can only respond as individuals because that's who we are. We can only respond as individuals to Jesus, who says, "Come, follow me." And you know what? That call doesn't happen only once. It's a calling that happens over and over. We hear and we respond. We see and we respond. Not just once, but day by day. And sometimes more than once a day. On some days our responses are public and ceremonial. It's such as that funeral for that individual. But other times we falter and fail. And at still other times, the ways in which we are called to respond are very quiet. And they don't get noticed. And maybe that's important. The only one it matters to is the one who you go to see or pick up or help out. You and I are called to go to those who need us most of all. That's what Jesus does. And sometimes those who need us most of all come to us. They walk right in our doors. They're looking for a safe space or a sacred place. They're looking for even if just an hour of peace in worship. And that might be enough to fill them to get through one more day or one more week. I guess in some ways we are like those tow truck drivers that one minister encountered. Those drivers, they go out to calls, they respond to calls in all sorts of weather, at all sorts of times during the day, and they never know what to expect. And that's it. We never know where or to whom Jesus will call us to serve. But when we are called, we have to remember that Jesus is our guide and our confidant. Talk to Jesus as you're going out and if you're not sure what you're doing. And when we respond to the call, I think it's always good to ask him to ride along with us. Then we know we can draw on what he gives us inside to face whatever comes, to meet the future with open eyes and open hearts. That's how we follow Jesus, just one step at a time, one call at a time. And your phone might get really, really busy with all the calls when you say yes.